So far, another pretty painful day for SoFi stock. There has been a short report from Muddy Waters, which has outlined some potential issues with the way that the company is handling the loans on their balance sheet and a bit of an attitude of nonchalance and very sort of cavalier mindset towards these kind of things, not really answering the questions from relevant party. But that being said, we're here to look at the price, not so much the fundamentals. Price often tells you all you really need to know about the fundamentals, is what I found. Of course, we've previously drawn in this parallel channel and we said, you know what? This looks like a pretty reliable and decisive way to be viewing SoFi stock. Once you come up to the top, you are then likely to go down to the bottom of the parallel channel and vice versa. So probably our next stop is going to have to be, unfortunately, to the downside on SoFi, all the way down to $7 or so, maybe a little bit higher, $7.5, something in this sort of region. That seems very much to be where the stock is headed. We've shown the momentum, the trend chart before, and I did warn people last video, once you have a sell signal on the indicator and a flip into a bearish regime, it's usually not a good look at all for a stock. And of course, you can sometimes flip back and forth between a bearish and bullish regime, but this is probably not one of those times since you had such a long period of bullishness. You need a cooling off period, which it looks like we're now having on SoFi stock. So this is a chart we've already looked at, and of course it speaks to the possibility and probability, in fact, of further downside on SoFi. Of course, the top end of the parallel channel sits around $33, around the all-time highs before that you had on the stock. So the optimist would say that it's still possible you could get back up there. But now that we've broken down below the midpoint of the parallel channel, I think it's most likely you do end up heading to the bottom at some stage, which of course still a pretty large down move possible. And this is often the thing with these kind of stocks. I think it's important for me to put out these kind of videos. If you can avoid being caught in the nasty bearish trend, then it often saves you some real downside. You can then buy back in at the bottom and make a killing on the way back up. At least that's typically what I tend to do with these kind of stocks. You want to be avoiding them when they're too hot and when everyone's in them, and then buy back in once everyone's sort of moved on and it doesn't look that good. But when the smart money then starts accumulating for another run, that's when you want to position yourself accordingly. Let's look at a couple of other charts to get a bit more perspective on SoFi. So this is a pretty interesting chart. I've drawn in a parallel channel here, but this is SoFi over gold. And what this tells to me is that actually most likely SoFi is near-ish the bottoms that it's found on this particular ratio, meaning it probably will outperform gold going forward, if I had to guess. Now, you might come a little bit further down, to be fair, to test the bottom of the parallel channel. That would be around a minus 20% underperformance compared to gold. But on the bright side, you might have outperformance of 100% or so if you were to come back up to the top of this parallel channel. You did sell off quite massively, but you tend to have these sort of V-shaped moves on this particular ratio. You know, you quite rapidly move up or down, and that's going to be as a result of gold typically being a risk-off, hedge kind of asset. So when gold is going up, SoFi often is going down and vice versa, which gives you this real, crash and volatile moves in this particular ratio. So keep that in mind, but this could mean that gold is going to be going down somewhat, would be my read on it. I think it's more likely that SoFi basically doesn't go down as much as gold, or maybe even goes up, while gold is sort of having a bit of a crash, a bit of a reset. So that's an interesting chart. This is another chart which I think is quite enlightening. You don't have too much data going back because, of course, SoFi is relatively new, but this is SoFi over Hood, another sort of financial name. While they're not doing exactly the same thing, SoFi operates more like a bank, whereas Hood is more like a brokerage. I think it's interesting that you have this kind of performance going on with SoFi in what seems to be a pretty long-term downtrend at the moment, bearish when compared to the valuation of Hood. Now, in recent times, you've collapsed to the bottom here of this potential parallel channel. Now, of course, if we wanted to be a bit pessimistic about it, we could say that you could drop even lower and that the true parallel channel looks something like this, and that would take you down on this relative valuation around 67% potentially compared to Hood. I think the optimist can say that probably this is the more likely parallel channel since you did respect these levels in recent times, which if you were to go back to the bottom would be only 34% underperformance compared to Hood. And again, the upside quite considerable here, 200%, so much more than with gold. Of course, SoFi has been battered quite a bit, whereas gold and Hood to some extent also has had quite a nasty sell-off. But this is an interesting chart, I think, if you compare it to another sort of financial name in, new sort of technology focused finance, similar sort of basket of stocks, I think. And this is the performance versus Hood. So make of that what you will. You might be a little bit bearish on SoFi as a name. just because you're in this downtrend, long-term structurally, that is not necessarily a great look, but equally, you're at the bottom of that range, similar to gold, so perhaps you can have a bit of a reversal there if you're more bullish on SoFi. And if we take a look at SoFi over the QQQ or the S&P, then there's not too much we can say about it other than you've got kind of what looks to be a long-term cup and handle pattern. I'm not sure I would necessarily buy into that. On a ratio, the patterns tend to not play out quite as often, but worth noting, if you wanted to be bullish, then you could say that that is a cup and handle going crazy. I don't know if I buy that. I'd be more looking at this just that you're in sort of a middle point of a potential range for the valuation compared to the S&P and QQQ. So if we were to draw in a parallel channel, something like this, I'm not going to be super accurate necessarily with it, but to me, something like this is how the relative valuation compared to the QQQ and similar with the S&P. If we look at it in candle, this is how I would have drawn this sort of parallel channel in here. You can drag this back here as well if you want to get to these sort of highs. Could be looking quite okay. So something like this, we're a little bit lower than the midpoint perhaps on the relative valuation, but that could signal that, if you're having a sell-off in the markets, then there's potential of a further 55% down move, which, funnily enough, sort of would coincide with a 55% down move on SoFi. Perhaps the S&P will actually hold up quite okay, whereas the tech stocks will be sold off, I could imagine. Not saying the S&P is going to hold up in the short term, but perhaps you do bounce from the parallel channel on the S&P. If we take a look at it, you maybe come down here and actually revert back, and maybe you end up chopping around the midpoint of this parallel channel on the S&P. So perhaps that means that tech will be, selling off a lot here, and perhaps, even if you do chop around on the S&P, the tech stocks are going to still have suffered quite a lot, and that might put them to the bottom of their sort of relative valuation pairs in this sense. So some things to keep in mind there. Definitely a bit of a bearish time, and I've got more downside as the most likely on the stock market at the moment, which you'll have seen if you've been watching my weekly macro videos on Sundays. That being said, I'm quite bearish on a lot of the stocks that I cover on this channel, just because those are the most popular stocks. A lot of the stocks that are primed to do well at the moment are a bit more boring and a bit less exciting. If you want information about those kind of stocks, the ones that I'm personally investing in, as opposed to these sort of stocks that I think we have to be a little bit bearish on at the moment, such as SoFi and tech names, then you can check out the premium service. I don't talk about it very much because it's still very small, but it's something that I offer. It's mostly swing trading, so if you're looking for some quick flips and all this kind of stuff, or in and out trading, then it's not going to be the thing, but I do identify what I think are some structurally strong stocks that end up going up, and we get out of them before the sort of bearish trend turns. At least that's what I aim to do. And of course, you get the custom indicator that helps you to filter for the regime, and of course the sell signals, buy signals from this indicator. But regardless, sorry, that's enough pitching. I don't like to pitch, especially because the channel is fairly new, but if that's interesting to you, then do check it out. Anyhow, thanks very much for watching, guys. As always, subscribe for more daily videos, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.